in whole of South Asia to say that somebody doesn't need an introduction and then speak 20 minutes giving an introduction. So I'm delighted that at least that convention has been flouted here. So without much ado, let us start straight away with Shiv Vishwanathan. He is one of you and should certainly not need an introduction. Shiv.
How much, 15 minutes? 15 minutes roughly?
I think that's time. Lovely.
That should do?
1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
One of the places I've been doing field work over the last 15 years is South Africa. And one of the problems that has intrigued me is the Truth Commission. In fact, when I hear the kind of rosy, romantic colors in which the Truth Commission is sort of surrounded, one wonders whether the debate in Africa and the debate around the Truth Commission is captured in the narratives outside. In fact, if I think the Truth Commission was the biggest problem to Western political theory. If you take the works of Derrida, if you take the works of Kristeva, if you take the works of any of the Western political theorists, for them, after Auschwitz, there was no possibility of forgiveness. If you look at the early work of Hannah Arendt herself, she could not forgive. Because forgiveness, in fact, created a crisis in political theory. In fact, if you look at the Truth Commission, it is actually a narrative told in different ways, where the notion of forgiveness goes back to its indigenous roots. In fact, in a deep and fundamental way, the Truth Commission embodied the crisis of Western political theory. If you look at the concentration camp records, from the work of Primo Levi to Jean Emery, the question of forgiveness was not possible. Forgiveness was seen as a cozy, cute tolerance, to use the words of Jean Emery, because he, to a certain extent, said forgiveness is an attempt to erase German history. And he said Germans should not be allowed to forget. To a certain extent, this is caught, in fact, in the very way Hannah Arendt deals with the problem. For Hannah Arendt, the problem of Eichmann was something she couldn't forgive. And yet, Arendt, being a brilliant political scientist, raised a very interesting question. She said, Einstein is cliché. When evil is cliché, how do you handle it? Because the most cliched person in the camps was Adolf Eichmann. He said, what do you say to this guy who has nothing to say, who's a set of stencils, who can't think of an utterance without having been said before? And yet she was caught in a paradox. Strangely, she said, if Einstein is a cliché, is there a possibility of Western theory becoming a cliché by accepting a certain kind of discourse? For her, the question of forgiveness becomes important at two levels. One, do I forgive Heidegger? Do I forgive all the various boyfriends she had, to whom she had to reconcile? There was a question, the personal question of forgiveness. There was also a theoretical question of forgiveness. And in fact, Arendt's answer is incomplete. Deeply and fundamentally, she's not ready to go the whole way. She says forgiveness is possible, but only as a political relationship. I'm ready to forgive all those Nazis who were Nazis but not involved in crime. She was not ready to go the full way. In fact, you see this in all the major Western political theorists. They did not understand the Truth Commission. They knew it was a powerful event, but they couldn't explain the meaning of the event. And in fact, the same thing haunts Jacques Derrida. For a man who was a master of deconstruction, Derrida is the one who doesn't understand the Truth Commission. He treats Desmond Tutu like a village idiot, half saint, half idiot, more like a Dostoevskian character than as a man who gave an alternative philosophy. In fact, Derrida, in fact, says all this thing about forgiveness is almost French. It's like the French de Gaulle and Mitterrand, who always talked about national reconciliation. He said, reconciliation is a European epidemic. And then he said, it means meaningless. It's a way of creating erasure. France needed erasure, so it invented national reconciliation. And then he says, this epidemic of erasure now has become global, because even the Japanese and the Koreans are busy asking for forgiveness. Now, at that point, he makes an interesting point. He says, if you look at the cosmological roots of forgiveness, It actually comes from Abrahamic religions. It's Judeo-Christian. And what the Truth Commission tried to do, poor Desmond Tutu, illiterate as he was seen, was mainly taking Christianity over into Africa. As many people said, Tutu just gave the Truth Commission a Christian veneer. And in fact, this becomes more problematic when you look at psychoanalysts like Julia Kristeva, who says, you can't have forgiveness in the public domain. Forgiveness, like psychoanalysis, is confined to the privacy of the person. It is only an individual who can forgive. And therefore, she felt to a certain extent the idea of forgiveness threatened the public domain. But because the public domain as a sovereign domain needed the right of punishment. Order without punishment was unimaginable. So here you have a great series of political theorists. And this plague, in fact, spreads to the first works on the Truth Commission. Whether you read an Indian version of Rajiv Bhargav or you read Mohammad Mamdani, all of them are unforgiving to the Truth Commission. Sometimes the unforgiving nature of critical analysts to the Truth Commission itself is quite fascinating. But Mamdani makes a fascinating point. He said Tutu has considered everyone except the beneficiary. What happened to all the white and black beneficiaries of apartheid? Where are they being questioned? They didn't commit a crime, but the crime of silence is something I cannot forgive. So each of them tries to respond to a certain issue, till up comes Desmond Tutu, believing in forgiveness, talking like a Seventh-day Adventist. In fact, I remember Tutu going to Israel and talking about forgiveness. He steps outside and you see a slogan, Desmond Tutu is a Nazi pig. I mean, that much for forgiveness.
Desmond Tutu
is a Nazi pig. And he's stunned because he can't understand what's happening. At the same time, he's trying to say, how do I do this? How do I talk a language which doesn't make sense to Western political theorists? How do I talk a language which doesn't make sense to a punitive notion of justice? How do I create a dialect which goes beyond this? And it's then that a series of South African works began to emerge, which give the idea of Truth Commission a different flavor. Probably outstanding among them, apart from the work of Desmond Tutu himself, is the work of the poet and writer Anje Krog. Krog wrote a brilliant book, probably the best book on the Truth Commission, Country of My Skull. And it's there that she says something fascinating. She said it's pity that the Truth Commission had to be packaged for the West. Therefore, forgiveness had to be packaged as Christianity. Forgiveness had to be packaged as a kind of naive South Africanism on the advent of, with the birth of globalism. She said, these guys, it's almost as if South Africa doesn't understand its history. And then she says, if you look at it, what you had is a kind of nationalist program surrounded by a certain kind of African lingo, especially around the word Ubuntu, which Tutu uses with fascinating persistence. But then when you look at the records of the Truth Commission, when you look at the Truth Commission as a performance and utterance, you see the ethnography of a different worldview. And that's where Desmond Tutu becomes, from a village idiot to one of the most powerful philosophers. The charisma of the man lies in the power of his ideas. And there's one sequence which is absolutely fantastic. He's standing in front, and in front of him is the mother of one of the people who has been murdered. She's almost illiterate. And he says, Mama, do you understand what we are trying to do? She said, yes. She said, let me clarify it for you. When this man murdered my son, he lost his humanity. When my son died, I also lost my humanity. So this is an opportunity for both of us to recover our humanity. Forgiveness is the alchemy of the recovery of humanity. That had power. Because to a certain extent, forgiveness was not some namby-pamby sentimental act. It was an attempt to rebuild a society. Psychoanalysts see in it various elements of what he called restorative justice. The language of therapy is implicit in it. But if you look at it, it is actually, for want of a better word, the ethnoscience of ordinary Africa trying to reconstitute communities rather than nations. The power of this lies in the power of local language, in local morality. In fact, the West got it wrong. Derrida for once deconstructed it wrong. He said the Truth Commission is something surrounded by a Christian veneer. But if you look at the language of Mandela, Tutu, and even earlier Biko, the language is that of communities, of Ubuntu, which had actually local roots. The idea of Ubuntu was very different because it began by emphasizing unity, community. In fact, Antje Krog makes a stunning comparison. She says of all the people with the Truth Commission used in as Western philosopher, Hannah Arendt was central to the Truth Commission. But he said the trouble with Arendt is when she has a dialogue, it's a Socratic dialogue. It's between two parts of the self. But he said when an African has a dialogue, it's between the I and the possibility of the other. Forgiveness involves community. It can never be an individual act. I think in that sense, deeply and fundamentally, for all its romance, the Truth Commission has not been understood because the category of forgiveness undermines Western political theory. Ubuntu, as connectedness, as wholeness, demands a different kind of language. In fact, at the very moment the West is abandoning the Truth Commission, the various groups in South Africa, Kenya, and others, in fact, there's a brilliant move today. In fact, I just got the letter yesterday, where the people in Uganda have decided to apologize to the Indians whom Idi Amin threw out. He said, the moment of truth will be the moment we recognize that Idi Amin did this to the Indians. Uganda cannot live as a democracy till the Indians come back in memory and come back as citizens. It is this, so forgiveness for Tutu was not just a moral and ethical act of restitution. It was something ordinary to the community. In fact, if you look at the records of the Truth Commission, there's nothing dramatic about it. But the drama is in very simple things. You have the Western journalists coming in and saying they're utterly cynical about an act. And suddenly you see a man who has tortured someone get down and wash the man's feet. The victim is stunned. Yet these kinds of dramatic acts need to be understood. And we need a different language. For Hannah Arendt, forgiveness could only be political. It was part of the social contract. For Kristeva, forgiveness was only a psychoanalytical, individualistic act. For Derrida, it was only a kind of residue of a kind of Judeo-Christian religion. And what Tutu does is he takes local philosophies, local roots, and gives it a certain cosmopolitanism, a certain globalism, where forgiveness becomes the basis of defining a community. And in fact, what he says is the only way, forgiveness is not just forgetting the past. Forgiveness, as Arendt later acknowledged, was the right of the past not to determine the future. Forgiveness is futuristic. And I think that is the beauty of Desmond Tutu. I'll stop here, because the controversies, in fact, are quite deep. Yeah.
One of you wanted to go early.
Do you want to go first? Thank you. I want to first start by thanking Professor Jahan Beglu for this invitation and the center and its staff. It is always a hard, difficult act to follow Professor Shiv Viswanathan's very powerful presentation, but let me shift the focus a bit. While I largely tend to take a bit of a difficult, or should I say critical, I don't know, of taking a normative stance on any desirable idea. That tends to lead us to create paradoxical outcomes. So if you were to take forgiveness and elevate it to a certain sense of nobility, then would there be justice at all in the world is a question that remains asked and unanswered. And I think that's a dialectic we have to keep open. So I listed to speak, do some bit of a comparative, elaboration on Gandhi and Lincoln. But I must state at the outset, I'm neither a Gandhi scholar nor a Lincoln scholar. But where I try to intervene is from an organizational studies point of view. And my particular contribution perhaps in terms of starting a dialogue is to take a onto-epistemological stance on what forgiveness and what justice and what the other, which is revenge, is from a managerial, more organizational perspective. It's often forgotten that in contemporary situation that we live in, that organizations are everywhere. And they're both the sources of what would be considered progress, and also, to my mind, great spaces where great injustices are committed in their everydayness. Not episodic, as in some revolution and its antimonies, but it's in everydayness. So to take the stance of forgiveness as a way to organize our ideas, our thinking, and our estimations and our evaluations of organizations would be to close the door to understand that who forgives who and for what. Because as Professor Vishwanathan quite rightly pointed out, that what is the cause for us to evaluate whether a particular event or an occasion demands evaluation that would lead us either one way or the other. And so the processuality of it, and to recognize the prosaics of it, that is the everydayness of it, that is what goes inside the corporations, firms, organizations of various kinds. Spaces which I largely considered as spaces where hegemony, domination, everyday oppression is committed. So given that, certain ambivalence towards the idea of forgiveness has to be retained in our consciousness. That's my starting point. So the organizational studies, which is the studies about management, more academic base for management studies, is going through a crisis of sorts, like many other disciplines, postmodern turn, cultural turn, all kinds of turns. And I was reminded of one of the reasons is that for about 30, 40 years after the Second World War, there was a certain sense of certitude, certain sense that there is a base foundational knowledge for managerial conduct. And to borrow a facilitas title of Professor Nandi, that field, maybe I'm extending it a bit, is facing a twilight period of certitudes, which is the title of one of his monographs. So in this period of liminality, there is a great space for a sort of, for very long time, sociology and organizational studies wanted to run away from metaphysics. Now the metaphysics is back with vengeance into the organizational studies. And what is underpinning that and what relates to Gandhi Lincoln's sources of forgiveness or a certain compassion and understanding that one can easily identify is this onto epistemological orientation of a particular kind, which is to say that there is a sense now that the world is getting too complex from a perspective of the managers and the leaders or whatever you want to call them, and that we are facing a period of ambiguity, uncertainty, complexity, turbulence, etc. And then then we are unable to develop sufficient basis for managerial practice. So that much is understood. And how that relates back to Gandhi and Lincoln, to my mind, is that often in the popular imagination, to my limited understanding, that the source of their forgiveness seems to be imagined to originate in their noble souls, which is psychological orientation, or from a religious inspiration. But as you know, a reasonably surface level understanding would, at least to me, suggest that it had much more to do, perhaps not exclusively, but much more to do with the fact that both Gandhi and Lincoln understood that their basis of their conduct was not founded on any sort of certain knowledge. And that often seems to be how they seem to imagine when, for example, Lincoln writes a letter to one General Joseph Hooker, who was accused, or at least that's what Lincoln heard, of telling that Lincoln is a bad ruler and we need dictatorship. And Lincoln writes back to him saying that, well, I heard this, and in spite of that, I'm promoting you to head an army. But I assure you that only generals that win the wars can become dictators. But when it looks like he's condoning at some level, but from the point of view of a processual vision that seems to guide both Lincoln and Gandhi, is that human beings, for them, are not psychological entities. The tendency to attribute traits and fixed traits that seems to guide their behavior is a sort of an imagery that both Gandhi and Lincoln doesn't seem to carry. What they seem to think is that human beings are in the process of making, in the process of becoming. So an act of forgiveness is an act that embraces processuality. That is to say that this particular act may have to do with the relational context as opposed to a fixed trait-based source. And the other is the fact that they paid great attention to human dimension in a prosaic sense, in its complexity. And they would receive a great deal of information about people they're dealing with. That attention to detail, which is one of the sources today in organizational violence, the tacit implied violence that is practiced every day, is to do with leaders and managers are often seeing themselves as celebrities, looking outward, generating revenues, and the everydayness of neglect, marginalization of lower level workers, etc., seems to miss their attention. And as a consequence, they are much easier to label people as good and bad. And as a consequence, there is a structural basis for so the subtle and everyday violence, which is much more problematic than the episodic and aggravated violence that gets visibility in the public spaces. The other aspect is that there is a tendency in much scientific theorizing, both management otherwise, is to attribute intentionality, that every act has to have a causal relationship to someone intending to do something. And to me, my reading of Gandhi and Lincoln suggests that they understood that sometimes people do things that they have not fully grasped. And often they do things and then they find a rationale to what they have done. So this reversal of rationality, this seems to be the other basis for their generosity towards those who they found deviant or exhibited deviant behavior. So the third, the epistemological basis seems to be that often we would like to fix the things, take the static entities and fix them. Human beings as having fixed nature, and that in many ways diminishes leadership's agency. That imagination that leaders have a role in constructing a human being, and then that it is not the discovering the traits, but it is inventing them, in many ways creating projects of self-fulfilling prophecies. That to me is what in many ways is labeled as transformative leadership styles of both Lincoln and Gandhi, that they didn't look out to the world to find objective knowledge or objective human beings they can measure, label as good, bad, but they were actually trying to invent possibilities, where possibilities were always, actualities were always lesser than the possibilities, and then that the gap between the actualities and possibilities is something that they seem to have strived to bridge. But all of this is very demanding for an ordinary manager or ordinary leader, because to show generosity and to justify it to others not involved in the act but are affected sort of stakeholders is to sell doubt and ambivalence. And selling doubt and ambivalence is not an easy task for anyone. And that perhaps is one of the most important reason why managers or leaders often resort to easy way out by punishing, because to tell people that one should be generous because we haven't fully understood or grasped the situation in which a particular deviation occurred is to suggest that to legitimize doubt. Legitimization of certitude is easy in modern condition, but legitimization is doubts requires crafts of storytelling, crafts of creating narratives of plausibility as opposed to static narratives of scientific explanations or using authority to end the conversation. And the other aspect is the skill set, or rather a certain dialogical imagination, which was referred to, certain answerability ethics, as Bakhtin would call. That sense that every act of deviation is a response to something that has occurred before, and is also an answer to something to come. So in that answerability to both the past and the future, and the open temporality that implies, which is to say that neither the past nor the future are fixed or are predictable and fixable. And therefore, one has to watch out for the possibilities for creating a world rather than to discovering it. So that seems to be the other aspect of their onto-epistemological stance of both Lincoln and Gandhi. The other and more delightful side of their personalities and their practices seems to be they are always looking for possibilities to be surprised. And where does this come from? Did they learn it in a, of course, Gandhi had some bit of a privileged education, and Lincoln has to learn all that he could about literature, religion, everything, being an autodidact. But did they learn in the schools, or do they acquire? And this question is very relevant as to how do managers and leaders acquire skills of storytelling, narrative, and processes of legitimizing doubt, which is central if you want to create a sense of generosity in organizational practices. To me, and it is very obvious case to make, but it's important one to make too, even though it is obvious, is that the process of learning to be self-construction, managerial or otherwise, that those processes are today taken for granted. That one gets an MBA, one learns to be a good manager. But for Gandhi and Lincoln, the processes were experimental. They had these unique opportunities to experiment being forgiving or generous or good managers or leaders. So that the ability to have these mindful practices from a very early age, try them out in adversarial conditions, and be reflective practitioners, and their school being the open world of adversity, that seems to be the source, to my mind, of their playfulness, their ability to integrate contradictory visions and tendencies, and their ability to show generosity to those they disagreed with. So this, I think, when we think about educational processes, this what now getting increasingly labeled and entering into the business school curricula is the experiential learning. Of course, if done well, it could make a great contribution, but it will all be normalized or rationalized, to borrow all good ideas get rationalized and normalized in practices that are already deeply the dominant logics of education in our country or elsewhere. So this need for practice in adversarial situation to develop a leadership orientations that are more likely to grasp and embrace the uncertainty and the complexities of human existence, and the construction of self in a world that is marked, to my mind, by more by invisible violence, and invisible practices that perpetuate injustice in organizational life. I do think that I'm not, although however tempting it may sound, from a managerial and organizational studies point of view, I'm not so enthused or excited to elevate the idea of forgiveness as some sort of a transcendental philosophy that needs a greater investment on our part than its opposite, to think about justice. To think about justice not in terms of the people who seem to be worried about violence, because often people who seem to worry about violence in organizational life are the people who are privileged. So could we find a transcendental platform to promote forgiveness? I suspect no. I suspect no, as long as we continue to have so much grave injustice hidden, invisible to us, but experienced by those who experience at the sharp end of that injustice. With that, I stop. Thank you.
Dr. Sadar.
Let me go there. Good morning, everyone. Professor Ramin Jahan Biglo, thank you for inviting me here. Respectful chair. I'm talking about a country which has a long tradition of forgiveness and peace, and that's Afghanistan. To understand what I said, at that long tradition of peace and reconciliation in Afghanistan, one need to go back the history and revisit the history to understand this point. The best example of this could be the larger cultural capital that existed in the medieval Khorasan, Sistan, and Kabulistan, which are the predecessor of the contemporary Afghanistan. So the larger cultural capital in the medieval period, it had been the rich Persian Sufi mysticism, which has been inculcating the tradition of forgiveness and peace among the people. One of the exemplar of this could be Maulana Jalaluddin Balkhi, which is famous as a Rumi in the Western world. So one of the famous poems that he has given to us is that you might have already read about is following. He says, "Come, come whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of living. It doesn't matter, ours is not a caravan of despair. Come, even if you have broken your oar 1,000 times. Come yet again, come, come." So while this poem of Balkhi has been given in a spiritual context, however, what you realize in Afghanistan is that such kind of Persian poetry has been deeply practiced in everyday life of the people. So and it has formed the interpersonal connection between them. Now here, I'm not talking about the tradition of forgiveness from the Persian Sufi mysticism, but what I'm going to talk about is the dynamics between revenge and forgiveness at the macro-political level in Afghanistan. So for me, in the contemporary modern history of Afghanistan, Afghanistan has experienced 5 different waves of violence and conflict and violation of human rights. These 5 levels of violence has been or represents the 5 vicious cycles of revenge in the country in one form or the other. Every new government that had come in Afghanistan declared the symbolic practice of amnesty. However, they themselves have fallen back in the trap of, or they have embarked the pursuit of persecution of their opponents. The very first wave was the violence of state formation in Afghanistan. The modern state formation of Afghanistan goes back to late 19th century by Amir Abdurrahman in 1880s. So while he came into power, as he quotes in his own book, Taj al-Tawarikh, that he was confronted with 40 revolts. Out of these, 4 revolts were the major one. What he did, his response was suppression of all these revolts. In this process, he not only killed the people, but actually he enslaved particular ethnic groups and confiscated their lands. and this process continued for 20 years. By the time that his son came into power, Amir Habibullah, he offered symbolic forgiveness. However, this forgiveness that he offered was not for the remembrance, as it was a tradition. For example, it has been the tradition of South Africa, but it was to get rid of the past injustices that has been done. The second wave of revenge and atrocity began with the Musahiban dynasty, which began in 1930s. And this wave also, Nader Shah, who came to power and seized the power from a Tajik Amir Habibullah, he not only persecuted the followers of Amir Habibullah, who were mostly the Tajiks and Uzbeks, but also he persecuted the followers of a reformist king of Afghanistan, Shah Amanullah. So it was also, you will see the targeting and revenge as exercised without due process of law in the country. The third wave began with the communist revolution in Afghanistan. When the communists came in 1974, so you will see that a mass exercise of violence and revenge. People are forcibly disappeared, detained, and executed without even informing their families. The Dutch government came up in 2013 with a death list of 5,000 people. This list, when you go through, the 5,000 people has been persecuted in the very first year of the communist regime. And in front of all the names of this list, for example, you will go through, has been written as a royalist or Maoist, Islamist. So anyone who did oppose the communist ideology, irrespective of their community or background, they were persecuted without due process of law. And when the Soviet Union 1 year later invaded the country, so you will see again the Soviets also involved in this process of revenge collectively. They bombarded and destroyed the villages, the crops of the people, and also the irrigation system, whatever it was there. So a mass exercise of violence was there. The fourth wave of violence and atrocity began with Mujahideen. When the Mujahideen came, Professor Rabbani, the first president of Mujahideen, he declared an amnesty of all the communist and the ex-government bureaucrats. However, what you realize at the practical level was a revenge which was exercised. Not being able to establish a broad-based, inclusive, and functioning state, Mujahideen failed to implement their declared amnesty. So at the same time, again, what we see is this amnesty has not been for the purpose of forgiveness. It was again for the purpose of forgetting the past. So different Mujahideen factions exercised prerogative power to detain, abduct, rape different communities of their opponents. This level of atrocity raised when Taliban came into power because they exercised a level of crime and atrocities which was to a level of ethnic cleansing, you can say. However, Afghanistan realized a shift in 2001, which was a transformation from a conflictual situation to a post-conflict situation. So in this process, as most of the other communities that from an autocratic state to a democratic state, one of the example of South Africa, you needed to address the past atrocities which happened in Afghanistan at these 5 levels. The last level is the terroristic attacks which has been conducted by Taliban and Hizb Islami in Afghanistan. So in Afghanistan 2001, a number of initiatives have been taken to map, document, and record all these past atrocities which happened. And this has been done by the UN agencies, non-governmental organizations, as well as by the Independent Human Rights Commission of Afghanistan. The very first report which Human Rights Commission of Afghanistan made was called Call for Justice. It came in 2005. This report indicates that the majority of the people in Afghanistan do recognize the need for forgiveness and peace in Afghanistan. But at the same time, they emphasize that the past atrocities should be addressed. Those who have been involved in the crimes, they should be called into justice. So later on, based on this report, government of Afghanistan was mandated and commissioned to form an action plan for transitional justice. So the next report which came by the government was called Peace, Reconciliation, and Justice. And this report came at the end of 2005. However, for one complete year, government of Afghanistan did not release the report of transitional justice. So this had showed that how much those who have been involved in the crimes, either the communists or the Mujahideen or the number of the Taliban, they were the main hurdle in front of the report to come out. This report puts 5 key activities for the government of Afghanistan to take in this respect. The very first was symbolic measures. Symbolic measures like Remembrance Day for the victims, establishment of a national museum for the victims, and as well as a monument for the victims. So what you see is the process of remembrance, which was exercised in South Africa. The second was an institutional reform. Those who have been involved in the crimes and atrocities in the past couple of years, the reform was supposed to sanitize the bureaucracy of the states and not allow those people to come again and exercise power. The third one was truth-seeking. Fourth one was reconciliation, and the last one was accountability measure. Now, a research which has been done by AREU, one of the research centers in Afghanistan, that shows that except 2 measures, which has been the Remember the Victim Day, which was established in Afghanistan, and as well as one more measure, which was establishment of a commission inside the government, all other steps has not been implemented. Later on, United Nations also came 1 year later, in 2006, came with a report of conflict mapping in Afghanistan. And this report mapped all the atrocities and crimes which happened since 1978, the time of the communists, till now. When this report came, a certain anxiety was framed in Afghanistan, especially among those who have been involved in the crimes. So these people did not, so they made an effort for not documenting all the crimes which happened, but as well as they pushed for kind of reconciliation, the concept of reconciliation which was based on forgetting, not remembrance and forgiveness. That's why the Parliament of Afghanistan, which is mainly consists of these warlords and those who have been in the, involved in the crimes, passed a law which was called amnesty. And this law highlights a kind of grants, a kind of immunity for those who have been involved. So analyzing all this process, what you will see is that reconciliation, which has been reconciliation or amnesty, which has been granted, either you will see it in the early 19th century when Amir Habibullah gave to the victims of Amir Abdurrahman, or the one which was exercised by the Mujahideen, or the recent one, which has been the ratifying of amnesty law in the parliament in 2007. All these are in the, and you can see that they want to emphasize on the forgetting of the past, painful past. This is what one of the scholars, Drik Rasmussen, called reconciliation to forget versus reconciliation to forgive. So what he defined reconciliation to forget is a process of denial, justification, excuse, carefully worded and physically cautious apology, minimal negotiated compensation, concluded by a final resolution to settle the matters once and for all. So again, this is what we realize in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, there's continuous denial of the past atrocities. They do not want to remember what has been done to the people. Rather, there's a kind of justification for that. And if you push to a certain extent, for example, with regard to the case of the communist atrocities, there's a little kind of justification and as well as recognition for it. So, but what we had opposite of it is exercised in the South African tradition that has been Professor Ramin Jan Bigelow and others quoted Desmond Tutu, that what he says is, without memory, there has not been healing. And he also says somewhere else that we remember, that's why we forget. So what we need in Afghanistan is to emphasize on the rule of the memory and also forgiveness at the public level. The last thing that I want to say and end with it is that in Afghanistan also you will see is the best, Afghanistan is a best example of how a victim turns into a perpetrator. The oppressed communities and groups whose grievances and traumas were not addressed at different stages in a peaceful manner had taken the initiatives themselves to accomplish those unaccomplished justice. Lost the trust on the state, or rather, in most of the time, see the state as an apparatus of suppression and revenge. They assume the right for themselves to exercise justice. So what you see is that it's a kind of vicious cycle of revenge, one after the other. Whoever comes, they assume the authority for themselves and exercise it. This was what, thank you.
Three excellent presentations, and let us now have a brief discussion on this. How much time do we have, Ramin?
We have 10
10, 15 minutes. So let us, for the questions and answers, or even a discussion amongst the panel itself.
It was a really inspiring presentations. My question is, first of all, I'm Fawad Poya from South Asian University doing PhD from Faculty of Legal Studies. My question is going to sir. I heard your presentation. You're looking very optimistic regarding the forgiveness. Actually, legally, if we look to forgiveness mostly in two framework, we can define it. One is in a pardon, another is the amnesty. Amnesty is mostly before the conviction of perpetrators, but the pardon is usually after the conviction. If we would be too much optimistic for forgiveness, then don't you think that we are diminishing the values of the courts and especially international tribunals that we have it and we had it and we have them? For example, ICTR that they were doing, and now we have the International Criminal Court. So if we press too much on forgiveness and amnesty, then what is the value of international tribunals? Another question is going to Sadr, that we are not able to see everything actually in Afghanistan in a black and white terms. For example, we have Dostum, that who was a warlord in Afghanistan, and he perpetrated many kinds of crimes during the history, when we can say. He came and he apologized from the people. Another issue that we have, for example, now Afghanistan government is negotiating with Hikmatyar for reconciliation, and we have the Reconciliation Council. So it doesn't mean that we have all those bad things. In Afghanistan, also some good things are going on. I need your comment.
Would you like to respond to both the questions?
One was to
Or maybe we start with Shiv then.
Okay. Frankly, I'm not a great advocate of international tribunals. Tribunals. Let me give you an example. You know, I was looking around for equivalent stories. Have you read Toni Morrison's Jazz? It's a brilliant story. There's a man who's rejected by his girlfriend. He's 50, she's 20. He murders her in broad daylight, and then the crowd around them sees it's a black woman. It says, it's a waste of an ambulance. And just as the woman is dying, the man's wife comes and tries to deface her for having humiliated for all these years. The question is, Toni Morrison then takes the story further. How do these people live with it? And in fact, it's quite interesting that if you look at the way these people learn to forgive each other and live with each other, the notion of justice acquires a different notion of storytelling. It's not a titration. It's not a measure. It's a kind of storytelling which allows place in a different cosmology. In fact, in the end of the story, Toni Morrison has this superb paragraph. She said, I expected both of them to avenge each other, kill each other. But the tragedy, the beauty of a novel is your characters surprise you. And I think what they really tried to do was say, justice as a measure doesn't make sense to me. Because what justice are you guaranteeing to a group of blacks? Are you talking about the original violence that was done to them? Are you talking about incest? Are you talking about the fact that many of them were taken away? That a black woman could have a child and then be forced to actually nurture the white woman and the white mistress's daughter. So he said, when you have such a pattern of violence, what does this word justice encompass? And in fact, the word they use is something more interesting. It's not therapeutics. It's ethical repair. How does a society learn to heal and repair itself? Goes beyond ideas of justice and forgiveness. And it's these wider folklore concepts which I think add to it a different measure of understanding. And if you look at the truth commissions today, they're now using these kind of concepts differently. So the one that's taking place in Uganda, the one that's taking place in South Africa, each of them tries to use folklore concepts while being sensitive to the world of the international tribunals. And in fact, when you read this, it's the international tribunal that looks parochial. The cosmopolitanism of folklore is something I'd weave into justice today. I mean, after spending about the last 10 or 11 trips and out, I've been just doing interviews. And if you look at that, the narrative is a very different kind. If you look at this Truth Commission itself, if you read the first 3 reports, it's a kind of official social science. But then as you read the narratives of those who have suffered and who are trying to work their way through, a different kind of language, a different kind of storytelling comes, where words like forgiveness, justice are not indexical. They don't have a measure. They become symbolic or iconic. So they have to be lived out in a different way. There's a difference.
To Professor Vishwanathan, and it is about erasure and trauma. While you mentioned that erasure of memory is neither possible nor desirable, my question is, in terms of forgiveness and healing as a political act and as an act of reconstructing communities, how does one go about erasure of trauma? Because I see that as necessarily important, because without trauma, without erasure of trauma, there cannot be healing. And as long as trauma exists, can forgiveness truly occur? Can reconciliation and reconstruction of a community, of a particular bond, actually happen?
Okay. When you looked at forgiveness and you looked at Western political theory, the emphasis was on the individual. But if you look at the Truth Commission as a performance, as a drama, the audience is crucial. In fact, when you look at the reaction, you begin with the dyad. And sometimes it's traumatic when you watch the two. I mean, a torturer confronting the victim. And when you look at that relationship, let's take that. You have a different kind of idea. But I think what happens is, in the way the thing is conducted, especially with the skill of Tutu, the chorus is important for the truth of the idea. The community is important. For in that moment of forgiveness, it is not a dyadic relationship, but the community enters in and becomes part of the act of forgiveness. I think you can see it time and again. I think Frank Ciccani gives a brilliant example of the man who tortured him coming and washing his feet. Immediately, the community joins the ritual, because to a certain extent, it becomes cathartic for all of them. So I think that part has to be emphasized. Sometimes it's individualistic, but with a sense of humor. I mean, I remember when Botha refused to talk to Desmond Tutu. I mean, he says, he had the Christian notion of confession. He said, I only apologize to my God. So Tutu very interestingly says, when you beat your wife, talking to God is not enough. You have to talk to your wife also. So I think one has to understand that the notion of the community is not a set of individualistic, dyadic relationships. It's a ganglion of possibilities. And I think when you look at the Truth Commission, you get a different notion of the social. I think Derrida used the word Abrahamic, which includes Islam. He was very clear about it. But I think the emphasis is on a Judeo-Christian tradition when Tutu and others start discussing it. But Derrida is very clear, it involves Islam. So the possibility of Islamophobia entering this discussion is, no, wait. I think let's take the bull by the horns, is minimal. I mean, it's a threat, but not everything in the world is threatened by it, okay? Because there was an openness, a cosmopolitanism you got to understand. And don't forget that a lot of the Indians who fought against apartheid were Indian Muslims, including Qadir Ismail and others. And they were very, very sensitive to these threats. I think when you read the actual gossip of the Truth Commission, you get a different sense of that than from what was codified and presented as a document. See, I think it's very interesting that sometimes the act of truth-telling itself is an act of catharsis. I remember a beautiful scene in the Truth Commission where they're actually talking about a man And he's talking about how he tortured a certain set of people. And in between he says, oh, I also shot this one dead. And then a boy from the audience gets up and says, thank you for telling me. For years I've been looking for my father. Now I know how he died. Sometimes the act of truth-telling itself begins the exorcism of trauma. Because the problem is silence. Hundreds of people disappear, thousands disappear. And in these acts of narrative, in fact, they come back ritualistic for a moment. In fact, there's a brilliant moment where, the South African Secret Service cuts off the hands of a guy. And they ask him, what will you take to forgive you? He said, if you let me have a ritual to bury my hands, that's enough. So when you start getting these stories, you realize the narrative requires different kinds of storytelling, different kinds of reaction, where in fact the conversation between victim and torturer can itself be an act of healing. In fact, I remember one of the wives of one of the great South African investigators suddenly goes to the therapist and says, look, my husband is having visitations. And the therapist goes and finds that this fellow was actually one of the people who used to use torture systematically. And all the man wanted, in fact, you see the scene when it's happening in the Truth Commission. As soon as the victim comes, you see two sets of reactions which are fascinating. One, the torturer goes and hugs the victim saying, remember me. And the victim says, how could I forget you? You tortured me every time on the 15th of July, which was the anniversary of the day we met. And then the narrative starts. It's interesting that it's traumatic for both in a very different way. The torturer, in fact, tells the victim, you exposed the following people. You were a betrayer. You were a traitor. But the victim insists that the torturer lists all the people he betrayed because that's part of the catharsis. So if you look at this narrative, it's very complex. It takes place, in fact, remember, all the time in community halls, where in the Truth Commission, the encounter between the perpetrator and the victim becomes central, but then it's played out at different levels as the audience responds to you. So trauma is considered, but not just as a medical or psychoanalytical fact, but as something a community can heal. And the idea of the community healing is, I think, central to this idea of the Truth Commission. It doesn't mean you eliminate the psychoanalyst or you eliminate the therapist, but that wider notion of community becomes central.
Well, thank you very much.
Can I ask you a question before you have the last?
And in one of the later wars. And, but not, and so they treated the Pathan Satyagrahis during their demonstrations much more brutally than anybody else because they didn't trust them at all. But not one Pathan ever even lifted a stick to hit back. They were uncompromising in both their incarnations. How from that they have come to the present state, is it only the responsibility of Pathans? Or are there other actors? And there was hint in one of the presentations that yes, there were actors. There are larger actors who contributed to the transformation also. That is the other story. That is the other story, underlying story. One final word. Has ethics any place in peace studies? Or would it be only a matter of prediction, prognosis, and analysis and diagnosis? I have no answer to that question at the moment. I know that many peace scholars are motivated by ethics, but that ethics, it has no genuine place in social knowledge today. Ethics is seen as something external to the body of scientific knowledge. I think there is scope for thinking of a kind of social knowledge system where ethics will also have a place in the very process, in the methods we employ. And in some ways, it will perhaps add to our concerns. There was enough evidence of this in today's presentations. I am very grateful that you have invited me here. I learned a lot from this encounter, and I do wish that you organize such similar exercises in larger scale and more frequently. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a very exciting panel, I think. Also because one of the things that it allowed us to do, especially everybody who listened intently to all the presentations, is it made these realities, these alternative realities, more tangible, more real, and much more imaginable than they were up until now. They allowed us to think in a completely different space outside of the knowledge matrix that we are so used to, that we can't imagine a justice system outside of a court of law, especially for us law students who have been through the years and years of training wherein we are told, here is how you ensure justice. And that justice is not what we're talking about today. So we are trying to envision alternate realities. We are trying to break away from the current knowledge matrix. And for being here and making that possible, I really thank the panelists, and I invite Professor Ramin Jahan Beglu to give away a few mementos to the participants so that they can remember today, and we can hopefully invite them again sometime to enlighten us with their knowledge. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks.